All right, you are good to go. You can begin.
All right, let's go ahead and call the case. If we could just start out with some quick introductions.
Could I ask what the all lost time is? Does anybody know what the all lost time is?
I don't, I'm sorry.
I can find out if you'd like to wait just a minute.
Yeah, that's fine. You can just send it in the chat.
Okay, will do.
Thank you.
Would you all like to wait on that, or do you want to go ahead and jump into it?
I was just about to tell y'all that y'all are good to start.
All right, well, then let's start off with some introductions from the parties.
Yes, Your Honor. Good afternoon. My name is Rachel Medina, and along with my co-counsel, Julie Canales.
Good afternoon, Your Honor.
And Alyssa Villarreal.
Good afternoon, Your Honor.
We represent the plaintiff in today's case, the estates of Genesis Petrillo.
Good afternoon.
Your Honor, may the defense also make our introductions at this time?
Go ahead.
Good afternoon. My name is Ava Zakowski, and I, along with my co-counsel, Thomas Azari.
Good afternoon, Your Honor.
And Sana Brooks.
Good afternoon, Your Honor.
Will be representing the defendant in today's case, Harper Martini.
Good afternoon, Your Honor.
Good afternoon. Before we get into any pretrial issues, I just want to ask, this is my first Zoom judging. Throughout the trial, would you all prefer if I left my camera on or turn it off while you all are doing your thing?
The defense would prefer if it was on.
Plaintiff agrees.
Okay, great. I just wanted to check on what folks were doing. That sounds great.
Your Honor, may I proceed with some housekeeping matters?
Go ahead.
First off, I would like to address a few of your preferences, as this is the first time we are in your courtroom. When we are sharing our screen to show exhibits and demonstratives, would you prefer that we ask first or do so as necessary?
I think you can just go ahead and share your screen.
And is it also safe to assume that exhibits remain constructively unseen by the jury until they are entered into evidence?
That sounds like a good idea.
Now, Your Honor, at this time, I would like to verify that you have the case materials in front of you. That includes case law, rules of evidence, and stipulation.
I do, although it's in sort of a clunky format. So if you'd like me to look at anything in particular, you might have to give me a second to pull it up, but I've got it all here.
Of course, Your Honor. And at this time, I would actually like to direct your attention to some case law, the first of which can be found on page 1 of the case law document.
Sure, I've got it up.
The case is Burdett v. Copenhaver, and this case addresses the 3 elements of civil battery we will be addressing today, which includes an act by the defendant, an intent to cause harmful act, and that it was indeed suffered by the plaintiff.
Okay, I'll take note of the case.
The next piece of case law we would like to direct your attention to can be found directly below Burdett v. Copenhaver on page 1 as well. It is Jacob v. Alexander. And in this case, it was ruled that the touching necessary for battery to occur is not strictly limited to the defendant physically touching the plaintiff, but rather can also occur by the defendant placing a harmful substance into food or drink that the plaintiff voluntarily or not consumes.
That makes sense.
Now, Your Honor, at this time, the plaintiff would like to invoke Rule 603, which is the constructive pre-swearing of all witnesses prior to today's trial.
Of course, all the witnesses will be assumed to be sworn in.
And at this time, we would like to also invoke the Rule 615, which is the constructive sequestration of all witnesses, barring party representatives. And as the plaintiff, today we have no party representative.
Anything from the defense?
Yes, the defense would like to designate Harper Martini as our party representative. As Ms. Martini is a defendant in today's trial, she will be present throughout today's case. However, her camera will be off until she's called to testify. Also for the court record, Ms. Martini uses they, them pronouns and the neutral designation of parent. As for formal references, Harper Martini uses the prefix of Miss, so Miss Martini.
Thank you. And Ms. Martini, you'll be in the courtroom. Everyone else constructively get out.
Your Honor, at this time, I would like to direct your attention to page 1 of the stipulations document.
Okay, give me 1 second. All right, I've got that up.
I would like to read stipulation 3 into the record. Stipulation 3 states that exhibits 1 through 10 are pre-admitted into evidence and as such may be referenced during opening statements.
Got it.
And now, Your Honor, with your permission, I would like to pull up the pretrial order to the screen. Ms. Canales. I would like to direct your attention to the second paragraph of the summary judgment section. It says that it states that this trial is limited to a battery claim and any evidence that is solely relevant to the negligence per se claim will be excluded from today's trial.
All right, thank you for pulling that up.
And with that, the plaintiff is ready to proceed with opening statements.
Great. Anything from the defense?
Yes, the defense has some more pretrial matters we'd like to attend to. So if there run into any technological or audiovisual issues during today's trial, how would Your Honor like us to proceed? For example, if there is a problem hearing or the internet cuts out?
Yeah, good question. Let's just put stuff on pause if anything goes wrong. I don't know if I can instruct the timekeepers to pause, but please try to pause if stuff is like going obviously and blatantly wrong. And especially sometimes there's people doing construction outside my house. So if you can't hear me or if you can't hear anyone, just someone jump in, shout it out, and we'll try to figure it out.
All right, thank you. Your Honor, at this time, the defense is ready to go.
All right, well then let's hear opening statements.
Yes, Your Honor. May the plaintiff proceed with our opening statement?
Please do.
Your Honor, opposing counsel, members of the jury, may it please the court. The defendant thought no one would notice. Members of the jury, today you are going to learn about how one person can have so much hatred for another. Genesis Petrillo and Casey Soto were two young adults madly in love with one another. The two met in college and were so committed to each other that they decided to take the next step in their relationship and get engaged. The happy couple had the rest of their married lives to be with one another. But that has all been cut short. On June 7th, 2019, the night of the rehearsal dinner, Mr. Soto went to bed expecting to see Miss Petrillo walk down the aisle the very next day. But instead, he was told Miss Petrillo slipped into a coma due to poisoning, and later, Mr. Soto found out his bride-to-be died. Mr. Soto missed the love of his life's last breath by only 5 minutes. And to make matters worse, members of the jury, it is because of Mr. Soto's own parent, the defendant Harper Martini, that we are here today. Today, you are going to hear a lot about the defendant's winery, Peony Estates. It was at this winery that the happy couple had their wedding rehearsal, and it is this wedding rehearsal that brings us here today. During the rehearsal, the defendant gifted Miss Petrillo a bottle of Cara wine. Although this seems like a nice gesture, today you are going to learn that the wine was actually poisoned by the defendant for Miss Petrillo. You're going to learn how Miss Petrillo was the only one who drank from the bottle of wine, how Miss Petrillo was the only one who experienced poisoning, and how Miss Petrillo was the only one who died. The evidence is going to show you that the defendant had complete access to lethal pesticides, such as organophosphate pesticide. And the evidence will also show you how the defendant knew and was fully aware of what the pesticides could do to someone when ingested. You are going to hear about how the defendant thought no one would notice if they added pesticides into the wine for Miss Petrillo. Lastly, You will hear about how after recovering the bottle of wine from Ms. Petrio's room, it tested positive for organophosphate pesticide, the same pesticide that the defendant uses in their winery. Today, you will get to hear from a friend the happy couple shared, Angel Rodriguez. Ms. Rodriguez is going to tell you how much the defendant hated Ms. Petrio and how Ms. Petrio was scared for her life. You will also hear from Casey Soto himself. Mr. Soto is going to tell you how his own parent hated Ms. Petrio. And Mr. Soto is also going to tell you that he is here today because he is terrified of what the defendant is capable of. Lastly, you will hear from Dr. Kwan, an expert toxicologist who autopsied Genesis's body. Dr. Kwan is going to talk to you about the lethal effects of organophosphate pesticide, especially when mixed with wine. Dr. Kwan will also tell you how that is what killed Ms. Petrio. Today, as the plaintiff, we must prove by a preponderance of the evidence that the defendant is liable for battery. Firstly, we must prove that the defendant committed an act. Secondly, that the defendant's act was intended to cause harm. And lastly, that in result, Genesis Petrio suffered harm. To help you understand this burden a little bit more, I want you to know that you only have to believe the facts we present to you a little bit more than the story that the defense will tell you. Even if you believe us by 0.0001%, that is all you need to find the defendant liable for battery. In a few moments, the defense will come before you and try to convince you that this is just a classic case of a parent not liking their child's partner. But you are going to learn that not only did the defendant want Ms. Petrio to disappear, the defendant even offered to pay Ms. Petrio $300,000 to go away so that no one would notice. At the end of today's trial, my co-counselor, Jilly Canales, will come before you and will ask you to find the defendant liable for battery because the defendant thought that no one would notice. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. Any opening from the defense?
Yes, Your Honor. Can I have my timekeeper present on the screen?
Sure, go ahead.
May I proceed?
Go ahead.
May it please the court. Not every tragedy has a villain. This is Harper Martini, the proud owner of Peony Estates, one of the best wineries in all of Midlands. But most importantly, they're a parent who loved their son to the moon and back, a parent who raised their son on their own, a parent who would do anything to make their son happy. But that's not what the plaintiff wants you to see. The plaintiff wants you to believe that Miss Martini would intentionally hurt the person that their son loved deeply. The plaintiff wants you to believe that Miss Martini would hurt the person they love the most and ruin their well-established business at the same time. That's because they want you to see Miss Martini as the villain. But not every tragedy has a villain. Ms. Villarreal just came up here and told you that the defendant thought no one would notice. But members of the jury, she can't just say that. She can't just come up here and tell you a story. No, she has to prove it. Because the plaintiff and the plaintiff alone has the burden of proof in today's case. And it's the plaintiff's job alone to prove each and every element of that burden by a preponderance of the evidence. This is a battery case. That means the plaintiff has to prove that it was more likely than not that Harper Martini acted with the intent to hurt Genesis Petrillo by putting pesticides in their drink, resulting in her death. But members of the jury, what you're going to find out is that the plaintiff will fail to meet that burden because not one person in this courtroom today will tell you they saw Miss Martini do the things that the plaintiff claims. Well, that's because it didn't happen. Now, we as the defense don't have a burden to prove, but you will still hear from 3 of our witnesses. First, you'll hear from Dr. Cannon, an associate consultant who reviewed Dr. Kwan's findings. He'll tell you that the wine may not have been the source of pesticides. And I'll also tell you that Miss Petrillo's death may have been due to liver disease. Next, you'll hear from Austin Lewis, the head winemaker at Peony Estates. She'll tell you that the bottle of wine may have been contaminated after it was opened, and that Miss Martini would never jeopardize her business. And finally, you'll hear from Harper Martini herself. She's gonna get on that stand and tell you when nobody else can. They're gonna tell you exactly what happened. They're gonna tell you about the wedding planning and the night of the rehearsal. But most importantly, they're gonna tell you that they would never and didn't poison Miss Petrillo. And at the end of today's trial, when the plaintiff can't prove who the villain was in this case, my co-counsel, Mr. Thomas Bizzari, will come before you and review the testimony given and the evidence presented, and ask you to find the only verdict supported by the evidence. They'll ask you to find Miss Martini not liable for battery. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. All right, does the plaintiff wish to present evidence?
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, the plaintiff would like to call Angel Rodriguez.
Okay, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Please introduce yourself to the court.
Hi, I'm Angel Rodriguez.
What do you do for a living, Mrs. Rodriguez?
I'm currently a kindergarten teacher at Rapid River Valley Elementary School, and let me tell you, trying to teach kindergartners over Zoom is probably the hardest thing ever.
Why are you here today?
I'm here because my good friend Genesis passed away on June 8th, 2019. I just want to share what I know about what happened.
So I want to talk about Miss Petrillo some more. When did you meet?
I met her and Casey, her fiance, through a mutual friend. We were instantly best friends, like kindergartners on the first day of school.
So what was it like being friends with Mr. Soto and Miss Petrillo?
It was a blast. Even though they were dating, I never felt like the third wheel around them. And when they decided to get engaged and get married, I was so happy. You could just see how much they loved each other. I hope I find true love like that one day. They even asked me to be a part of the wedding party.
Miss Rodriguez, I want to talk to you about the defendant. Do you know Miss Martini?
Yes, but I don't know her very well.
How do you know Miss Martini?
Harper is Casey's mom, and the owner of Peony Estates, which is where the wedding ended up being planned to happen.
You mentioned earlier that you were selected to be part of the wedding party. What can you tell us about the planning of the wedding?
Well, I got to see a lot of the behind the scenes things, and I also got to see what I thought was the worst of Harper.
Can you tell us what you mean by that?
Well, Harper was always trying to change the things that Genesis and Casey wanted. Like, the wedding wasn't even supposed to be at Peony Estates, but Harper made them change it. All of the drama with Harper made things so tense, especially between Harper and Genesis.
What made you feel that there was tension?
Harper was always criticizing and insulting Genesis, and most of the things Genesis wanted, Harper had something negative or mean to say. They couldn't agree with her on anything, and that even things just got worse.
So I want to go ahead and talk about that a little more. How did things get worse?
Someone was always arguing with someone, and the conflicts just started to get more explosive, even on the night of the wedding rehearsal.
What day was the wedding rehearsal?
That was June 7th, 2019. The night everything happened.
So let's talk about June 7th, 2019. What happened at the rehearsal dinner?
Harper and Genesis could not stop fighting. And boy, if you thought kindergartners fought a lot, you haven't seen anything until you saw those two. Harper even said that Genesis should just leave and save this family the headache Otherwise, I will make you disappear.
And what did you do when you heard that?
I tried to ask Genesis about what happened, but all Genesis said was that she was afraid Harper was going to kill her. She looked so terrified.
So what happened later that night?
I saw Harper carrying a canister of pesticide right before the toast she made.
Did the defendant say anything about the canister of pesticide she was holding?
Yes, they said it was for Genesis.
What happened after the defendant said the canister of pesticide was for Genesis?
They gave 2 toasts after that. The first one was so negative towards Genesis that she was shaking under the table. And the second was really random and only addressed towards Genesis.
Now, can you elaborate on what happened during that second toast?
Yes, Harper was being weirdly nice to Genesis all of a sudden. They even gave her a special bottle of wine that no one else got. It was called Cara.
So let's talk about the wine a little bit more. What did Ms. Petrillo do with the wine?
After getting it around 10 p.m., I saw her pour multiple glasses of the special wine from Harper.
How did Ms. Petrillo physically appear after drinking the Cara wine from the defendant?
Around 11 p.m., she started to stumble and her speech seemed slurred. I had never seen her like that before. It got so bad after a few drinks with our friend Drew that I actually called 911 around 12:42 a.m.
So can you tell us what happened after you called 911?
We went in an ambulance to the ER. I stayed with her all night.
Now let's talk about the next morning. What happened that next morning?
Around 8 a.m., I found out from the doctors that Genesis had slipped into a coma from what seemed to be some kind of poisoning. I went back to Peony Estates to let Casey know.
Can you tell us what happened when you went back to Peony Estates?
I ran into Harper, but before I could even say anything, Harper somehow knew that Genesis had been poisoned and they were already planning on canceling the wedding. I don't even know how they knew that Harper had been that Genesis had been poisoned though.
So what happened after Mr. Soto found out?
Him and I went to the hospital, but we were too late.
Can you tell us what you mean by you were too late?
When we got to the hospital around 9:32 a.m., Genesis had already been dead for 5 minutes. That was one of the most heartbreaking moments of my life.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Cross-examination, Your Honor.
Sure. Just real quickly, my understanding, and I know it's the genders and designations of witnesses change from round to round, but as I understand it, the defendant takes they them pronouns rather than she her pronouns.
Yes, Your Honor.
May I proceed? Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Let's talk about June 7th. On June 7th, you claimed that Miss Martini and Miss Petrillo were arguing a lot.
Yeah, they couldn't stop fighting.
There was a lot of tension.
Yeah.
You claimed at one point that Miss Petrillo told you that they were afraid Miss Martini was going to do something to them.
Yeah, she was afraid that Harper was going to kill her.
You claimed that it was clear that Genesis was extremely scared of Harper.
Yeah.
Yet despite this, you didn't tell anybody, right?
No.
You didn't tell your friend Drew about this?
No, I didn't want to cause worry.
You didn't want to talk to Mr. Soto about this?
No, he already knew that there were problems between Harper and Genesis.
You didn't recommend to Miss Petrillo that she call the police, even though you claimed she was fearful for her life?
No, I figured if she wanted to call the police that she could do so on her own.
Later that night, you noticed that Miss Petrillo received a different wine than you, right?
Yeah, she received a wine that no one else received.
The name of that bottle was Car.
Yeah.
You noticed that Miss Petrillo took several glasses of that wine?
Yes.
Seeing Miss Petrillo drink that much was normal to you, right?
Yes, but the way she ended up reacting to it was completely out of the ordinary than normal.
You've seen Miss Petrillo drink more than that before, right?
Yes, and she had never reacted the way that she did with the Cara wine.
And you were concerned for her.
Yes.
She was stumbling.
Yeah.
She was slurring.
Yes.
You were very worried.
Yes, I even called the police.
Well, at that moment when you saw her, you didn't call the police, did you?
No.
You didn't tell anybody about her condition, actually.
No, but there were other people around. They could see.
It wasn't until Miss Petrillo told you to call 911 that you did, right?
Yes, when I tried to get her to go to bed and she knew something was wrong.
Well, Miss Petrillo told you that she's never felt this way before.
Yes.
But you didn't call the police then?
No.
Ms. Rodriguez, I want to be very clear about what you saw and you didn't see on June 7th, excuse me. You claimed you saw Miss Martini holding a canister of pesticides, right?
Yes, and she said it was for Genesis.
Well, to be clear, she said that she was joking, right?
Yes, but it didn't sound like she was joking.
That's a yes to my question. She said she was joking?
Yes.
To be clear, you didn't see Miss Martini put pesticides in the bottle of wine, right?
No.
You didn't see her near any bottles of wine while she was holding the canister of pesticides?
No, but she was headed towards the kitchen.
You didn't see her holding a bottle of wine while she was holding the canister?
No.
And you can't tell me that the canister she was holding ended up in the bottle of wine, right?
Right.
Thank you. Nothing further.
Thank you. Any redirect?
No redirect, Your Honor. May the witness be excused?
Yes, thank you. Any further witnesses from the plaintiff?
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, the plaintiff calls Dr. Kwan to the stand.
Doctor, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Please introduce yourself to the court.
How you doing? My name is Dr. Jimin Kwan.
And what do you do for a living?
I am the Chief Emergency Physician and Toxicologist Specialist at River Valley Hospital.
So what exactly does your job as a chief emergency physician entail?
Well, I'm responsible for admitting all ER patients as well as diagnosing them. And despite admitting all ER patients, I am assigned to poison cases as I am a toxicologist. I'm responsible for diagnosing the various toxins and coming up with a quick diagnosis to reverse the effects.
So what kind of education do you have to hold such a position?
Well, I have a Bachelor's of Science in Biology with a minor in Chemistry. I received my MD from UNC at Chapel Hill, and I continued my residency at Emory Department of Emergency Toxicology, and I continued there to do a fellowship in medical toxicology.
Have you ever been published in your field?
Yes, I have several peer-reviewed articles in toxicology and emergency medicine.
So why are you here today in court?
I'm here today to explain the conclusions I drew from the full examination of Genesis Petrillo in today's suspected poisoning case, as well as the conclusions I drew from the testimony as well as the testing that I ordered.
So what kinds of facts and data did you have to come to your conclusions?
I initially viewed Dr. Petrillo in the emergency room in which I did a full examination. I then ordered laboratory testing, which is a toxin and poison analysis test, which is exhibits 5 and 6, other exhibits, and the affidavit of Angel Rodriguez.
And were these sufficient to come to your conclusions?
Yes, there were.
Well, what type of method do you use when assessing a case like this?
Well, I have a two-part method. The first is the full examination, utilizing the acronym EMP, which is eyes, muscles, and pulse. I then utilize these symptoms to compare to laboratory findings.
And is this method reliable in your field?
Yes, it's actually the standard in my field. I can't recall a doctor who doesn't use this method.
And did you reliably apply this method to the facts of today's case?
Yes.
So I want to talk about the first part of your examination, the full examination. What can you tell us about that with regard to Ms. Petrillo?
I initially met Mrs. Petrillo in the emergency room, in which I smelled the fumes of alcohol on her breath. And then I noticed she was severely vomiting a red liquid, which is consistent with wine. So I initially thought this was an alcohol poisoning case, in which I later found out it wasn't.
So what made you believe it was something other than alcohol poisoning?
I began to suspect this as Petrillo's symptoms were contrary to those of alcohol poisoning cases. In alcohol poisoning cases, this would be completely different utilizing the EMP method. I brought a chart to further explain this.
Ms. Medina, can we put up the demonstrative aid for Dr. Kwan's testimony? Dr. Kwan, what are we looking at here?
Well, this is the chart that points out the key differences of the eyes, muscles, and pulse compared in alcohol poisoning versus pesticide poisoning.
And so what type of symptoms was Ms. Petrillo experiencing when you met her in the emergency room?
Her symptoms were completely in line with pesticide poisoning.
And can you tell us how that is?
Well, as you notice, the eyes are contracted and tearing in pesticide poisoning, and these were comparatively correct in Genesis Petrillo's symptoms. The muscle function was involuntarily twitching in Genesis' condition, and her pulse was irregular and slow. And this is contrary to alcohol poisoning, which you can see that the eyes are dilated, which were contrary to her symptoms. The muscle function is relatively normal, and the pulse is weak and rapid, which were all not present in Petrillo's symptoms.
Thank you, Ms. Medina. We can remove the demonstrative from the screen. Dr. Kwan, were you able to confirm your suspicion that Ms. Petrillo came into contact with pesticides?
Yes, I was able to do this through the poison and a toxin analysis test.
And would you recognize those tests if I were to show them to you in court today?
Yes, I would.
Ms. Medina, can we please put up exhibits 5 and 6, which have already been pre-admitted into evidence per stipulation 3?
Your Honor, I have an objection to these tests being shown. So can we take those down just for a moment while we talk about that? Thank you. Your Honor, I'm objecting. You're muted, sorry.
Actually, could we put them up and just pretend that no one's looking at them just so I can see them? We won't show them to the jury quite yet. Okay, so what's the objection here?
My objection, Your Honor, is under Rule 702. It's my understanding that this is a test, and a subsequent test will also be shown and these two tests are completely different from the methodology and the facts that Dr. Kwan relied upon to coming to his conclusions. In order for these tests to be shown and the results to be talked about, we need to go through all 4 prongs of 702 in order to qualify Dr. Kwan as an expert able to testify on these matters.
Your Honor, may I respond?
Please do.
Your Honor, that's actually not true. Both of these exhibits have already been entered into evidence under stipulation 3. Furthermore, with regard to the objection to 702 and laying foundation, Dr. Kwan has already testified that he relied upon both of these exhibits to come to his conclusions in today's case. 702 does not ask us to further lay any more foundation for these exhibits. He's already told us that he relied upon them and that they were sufficient to coming into his conclusions in today's case.
May I respond to that, Your Honor?
Well, could you address just the issue of why this evidence should be kept from the jury, although it's already been stipulated into evidence?
Your Honor, that's not the problem that I have, so much as that Dr. Kwan can't testify to how this test was conducted or the results of this test separate from this exhibit, of course. We have no problem with this exhibit being shown because it is, we agree that it is pre-admitted, but at the same time, Dr. Kwan hasn't told us what principles and methods he used to conduct this test, and we don't know if this test was conducted reliably applying any principles or methods at all.
So
That's the issue I have with this document.
So you take issue not necessarily with the document itself, but with the doctor's testimony about it not having sufficient expert foundation?
That's exactly correct, Your Honor.
And I'm sorry, could you explain to me one more time why you believe this doctor doesn't have foundation to talk about this?
Yeah, Your Honor, in the previous testimony that we've heard from Dr. Kwan, we heard that he used a method called the EMP method. And that method was specifically related to symptoms and symptom analysis and coming to a diagnosis based on those symptoms. That had nothing to do with testing. Because we don't know how these tests were conducted. We don't know if it was a reliable method, if that method has been reliably applied by other doctors, if it was reliably applied in this case. The method itself needs to be explained on how these tests were conducted, how the conclusions were reached through these tests, and then we can talk about those tests separately.
Okay.
Your Honor, may I respond?
Yes.
Your Honor, the witness has already testified that he conducted these tests as a second part of his method in today's case. Very clearly, Dr. Kwan told us that there are two parts to his method. First, the EMP method, and then comparing those symptoms to the test that he took of Ms. Petrillo. If opposing counsel had issue with how these tests were conducted, then they shouldn't have stipulated that they are pre-admitted into evidence prior to today's trial. Because they are pre-admitted into evidence, any objections to the authenticity or the way that these tests were conducted should have been brought up before this trial and not stipulated to by opposing counsel.
May I respond to that, Your Honor?
Yeah, and I think this is the last I'll hear on this.
Your Honor, that's not exactly true. Just because we allowed these exhibits to be pre-admitted and for counsel to bring them up at any point during the trial doesn't mean that Dr. Kwan can give us any testimony on how these tests were conducted or anything of the sort unless opposing counsel provides that 702 foundation. We agree that these tests were conducted. We agree that these tests results specifically are admissible as a part of this document, but at the same time, Dr. Kwan can't testify to them until that foundation is laid. And that's the point.
So defense, I think I agree with that idea that just because the evidence is admitted doesn't mean you couldn't bring any witness to the stand to talk about how this was done. However, exactly. I think this witness is qualified to talk about this evidence, so I'm going to allow him to do so.
Your Honor, can we have a ruling for the record?
The objection will be overruled.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Kwan, how did these tests help you confirm that Ms. Petrillo came into contact with pesticides?
Well, as you can see in Exhibit 6, it states that organophosphate pesticide was indeed in Genesis Petrillo's bloodstream. And if we continue on to Exhibit 5, we'll notice that Genesis Petrillo's BAC level was 0.16%, which is not consistent with lethality in alcohol poisoning cases.
Thank you, Ms. Medina. We can remove the exhibit from the screen. So, Dr. Kwan, taking into consideration that Ms. Petrillo tested positive for organophosphate pesticides in her system, how might that amount of pesticide affect somebody in their bloodstream?
Well, despite Genesis Petrillo having a significant amount of pesticide in her system, even in small doses, this can be extremely lethal.
And do you have any idea where this pesticide would have come from?
Well, there are 3 methods in which pesticides can enter into the immune system. And this is through inhalation, ingestion, and skin absorption. And I was able to cancel out 2 of these methods, which are skin absorption and inhalation, therefore concluding that the only possible way was through ingestion.
So based on your analysis, where did the pesticide come from if it were ingested?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, Mrs. Petrillo was severely vomiting, a red liquid that's consistent with wine. And due to this sole rejection of the wine, I was able to conclude that it came from the wine. I was able to confirm this through the testing of the wine bottle, which came back positive for pesticide, organophosphate pesticide, that is. And her stomach contents also concluded this.
And so what is your overall conclusion regarding the death of Genesis Petrillo?
I was able to conclude that Genesis Petrillo's unique symptoms were inconsistent with alcohol poisoning, but very consistent with pesticide poisoning. And that we can solely acknowledge that the only set in stone method that this could have happened is through ingestion of pesticide through wine.
Thank you, Your Honor. I have no further questions for this witness.
Thank you. Defense?
May I proceed?
Go ahead.
Good afternoon, Dr. Kwan.
Good afternoon.
I want to talk about what you can tell us based on your observations leading up to and after Genesis Petrillo's death, okay?
Yes, sir.
When Mr. Petrillo came to the hospital, you conducted an initial examination of her condition, right?
Correct.
Based on her symptoms at the time of your initial examination, you thought it was likely that she had ingested some amount of pesticides before coming to the hospital, right?
Yes, I was able to confirm this after the testing came back and through her symptoms.
But before those tests came back, after confirming the symptoms, that's right, you administered an antidote, didn't you?
I attempted to, however, she slipped into a coma before I was able to give her the antidote.
Well, sir, you put the syringe with the antidote in Miss Petrillo's body, right?
Unfortunately, I did not make it in time to give her the antidote, as stated in my report.
Okay, doctor. After Miss Petrillo fell into that coma, she died, right?
Yes, she did.
After she died, you got 2 test results back, right?
Yes, I received her reports sadly after her death.
Based on those test results, you learned that Miss Petrillo had a blood alcohol content of 0.16%, right?
Yes, and this is not lethal at all, so I was able to conclude it wasn't alcohol poisoning.
I just want to clear up something you said on direct examination. 0.16% and 16% are 2 completely different levels, right?
Yes, sir, significantly different.
Great. You also learned that Miss Petrillo had some organophosphate pesticides in her digestive tract, right?
Yes, she did, through the ingestion of wine.
After confirming those results, you concluded that Miss Petrillo had died as a result of pesticide poisoning. Am I right?
Yes, as any doctor would.
I want to talk about what you can't tell us based on those observations. Even though you know Miss Petrillo had organophosphate pesticides in her system, you can't tell us when she ingested that pesticide, can you?
Basing on the time frame, I was able to conclude that it did indeed come from the wine bottle.
That's not what I'm asking you, doctor. I'm asking you whether or not you can tell us when that pesticide was ingested. And you can't, can you?
I can reasonably deduce based on her arrival to the ER that it couldn't have been any day prior to coming into the ER.
Well, doctor, you don't know if it was ingested the night before or the morning of the ER visit, do you?
Well, as I said before, that pesticide poisoning cases are extremely lethal, in which Genesis Petrillo would have died before arriving to the ER if she did have it before arriving.
You don't know when those pesticides. Hold on, doctor. I just want to clarify what you just said. You just said that if Miss Petrillo had ingested those pesticides before coming to the ER, then she would have died before getting to the ER. Is that your testimony?
My testimony is that if it happened any day prior to her arrival to the ER, she would have died a day prior to arriving.
Okay, doctor. I just wanted to clear that up.
Yes,
but
sir.
Let's go back to what you can't tell us. You can't tell us whether or not You can't tell us the amount of pesticides that Ms. Petrillo ingested, can you?
No, I cannot, but I know even in small doses that it can lead to death.
And so on direct examination, when you said that Ms. Petrillo ingested a significant amount of pesticides, you meant that you didn't actually know how much she had ingested. Am I getting that right?
Sir, I'm admitting that due to her drinking the full contents of the wine that contained alcohol, that this had to be a significant amount.
You don't know how much. Am I right about that?
No, sir, not based on laboratory findings, I cannot conclude that it was a significant amount, but based on the contents of the wine, I can.
Doctor, you can't tell us if Ms. Petrillo ingested that pesticide on purpose or on accident, can you?
No, I cannot.
You can't tell us if that pesticide was put in her food by another person, can you?
No, as I as well explained that prior to this case.
You certainly can't tell us that Harper Martini put those pesticides in her food, can you?
I also mentioned this prior to this case that I cannot.
That's a yes. You can't tell us if Harper Martini did or not, can you?
No, sir.
Despite all of that, you concluded that pesticides were the sole cause of Ms. Petrillo's death, correct?
Yes, and I can conclude this.
I want to talk about why you might be saying that. You're a member of the board of directors of Doctors for Organic Solutions, aren't you?
Yes, I am.
And that organization advocates against the use of chemical pesticides. Am I right?
Yes, and that's to prevent problems such as this.
You believe that chemical pesticides are a scourge to the environment and to humans, right?
Well, if it leads to potential cases as this, then I would totally agree with that statement.
You believe wholesale that chemical pesticides are a scourge to the environment and humans, right?
Yes, sir, and it can lead to death of humans.
You believe that this case proves your point, right?
It can be an example.
In fact, you're hopeful that this case will convince legislators to limit or outright ban the use of chemical pesticides. Am I right?
Well, wouldn't you as well?
Doctor, I just need you to answer my question for me, okay? And my question was, in fact, you're hopeful that this case specifically will convince legislators to limit or outright ban the use of pesticides. I'm right about that, aren't I?
Yes, sir.
Thank you, doctor. I have nothing further.
Any redirect?
Briefly, Your Honor.
Go ahead.
Dr. Kwan, I want to ask you, is your advocacy against chemical pesticides affecting your testimony in court today at all?
No, ma'am.
Thank you, Your Honor. I have no further questions.
Thank you, doctor. You may be excused.
And there's no recross based on that, for the record.
Right. Appreciate it. All right. Let's hear another witness from the plaintiff, if we have one.
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, the plaintiff calls Casey Soto to the stand.
All right.
Would you please introduce yourself to the court?
Hello, my name is Casey Soto.
And what was the nature of your relationship with Genesis Petrillo?
Genesis is my wife. She was my wife. We loved traveling together. Our big dream is that we were going to travel outside the country once we got married. I just miss her a lot.
And how did the two of you meet?
We met at the Rosie and Pedro. She was dancing to Boyfriend by Justin Bieber, and I knew at that moment that I was going to be her boyfriend. And I know it's a really cheesy thing to say, but we had a perfect relationship. The only thing that ever got in the way was my parent, Harper Martini.
Now, you mentioned the defendant. Do you mind talking a little bit about your relationship with them?
Yeah, Harper's a great parent. They took care of me all by themselves ever since I was a little kid. We've always been really close, even to the point where I refer to them by their first name. The only time we ever had any disagreements was about Genesis.
Now, why did you and the defendant fight about Genesis?
Well, Harper owns their own winery, Peony Estates, and they like to show off the wines they've created there. And they were showing some of the wines to Genesis, and Genesis didn't realize that it was their wine, and made a really snarky comment about it, and Harper's been hostile ever since.
Now, you mentioned the defendant works at a winery. Can you elaborate on that, please?
Yes, they used to work at Rosie and Pedro, but when I got older, they opened Peony Estates. They love that place second to only me. That's actually why we had the wedding destination changed from Rosie and Pedro to Peony Estates.
Now, Mr. Soto, what happened with the wedding?
Well, my parent took over all aspects of it. They took over the location, the catering, invitations, signs, and I'm a pacifist. I don't like conflict, but Genesis is much more hard-headed than I am, so she confronted Harper about it.
Now, what exactly did Miss Petrillo do?
She called my parent, and they had a really big fight, and I don't like fights, so I left, so I don't know what was said during the phone call.
But did the phone call change anything?
No, if anything, it made everything 10 times worse.
What do you mean?
During the phone call, Genesis let slip that we wanted to move to France, and that made Harper pretty upset.
So how exactly did the defendant react?
My parent screamed at Genesis and said, Casey has to stay in Midlands. Whether you stay with him, leave to France, or end up 6 feet under, I don't care.
And how did you react?
Well, I was terrified because up until this point, Harper had never said or threatened Genesis in any way.
Now, Mr. Soto, I want to talk about the rehearsal dinner. When was that?
It was June 7th of 2019.
Now, how did things go at first that night?
It went as things usually do. Things were awkward and tense. Harper snapped at Genesis for being late. What happened a little later into the night is what really scared me.
And what happened?
Genesis told me that she was scared that my parent was going to hurt or harm her. I started getting really worried at this point, but I decided to just suck it up and continue on with the wedding.
Did you have any other conversations with the defendant that night?
Yes, I tried to talk to them and explain that, look, it's my decision to go to France. It's not Genesis's. But they wouldn't have it, and they yelled at me and said, you can't let Genesis break up our family.
Did you hear from the defendant again that night?
Yes, they made 2 toasts. The first one was aimed at Genesis, and it was predictably pretty rude. The second one was also aimed at Genesis, but was like weirdly nice.
Can you explain what you mean by weirdly nice?
Yeah, they actually gave Genesis this really expensive bottle of Carl wine that no one else received, not even me.
Now, Mr. Soto, I want to ask you about your wedding day.
Uh-huh.
Can you tell us about the morning of June 8th, 2019?
Yes. Around 7 a.m. I woke up, and around 8, Harper came into my room, and they said that Genesis had just disappeared and that we should cancel the wedding.
Did you speak to anyone else after that?
Yes. Angel Rodriguez came in my room, and she took me to the hospital.
Now, what happened when you got to the hospital?
I rushed to see Genesis. I was 5 minutes late. I was 5 minutes late to seeing the love of my life alive. I just broke down crying. I don't remember everything that was said, but all I remember was the doctor saying that she died because of poisoning, probably pesticide poisoning.
Now, Mr. Soto, do you have any reason to believe that Ms. Petrillo could have been exposed to pesticide?
I don't know. When I first heard pesticide, I thought of Peony Estates, but that didn't make sense to me because I ate and drank everything that Genesis had. The only thing we didn't share was that bottle of wine that Harper gave to her.
Thank you, Mr. Soto. No further questions, Your Honor.
Thank you. Cross-examination?
Yes, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Mr. Soto.
Good afternoon.
Your parent is Harper Martini.
That's correct.
And growing up, your family consisted of just you and Harper.
Yes.
Harper raised you alone.
Yes.
Harper was a great parent growing up.
Yes, they were.
Harper was present at all your school events,
Yes.
and your sports games.
Yes, I was the #1 priority in her life. Or
Harper-
their life, sorry.
No apologies. Harper really cared about you.
Yeah, they did.
Harper even wanted to have your wedding at Peony Estates
Yes.
to help you and your future bride save money.
Yeah. Yes,
They also wanted to use the wedding for publicity.
that's correct.
So she wanted the wedding to go off without a hitch.
That's what she told me.
Yes.
Okay.
Harper wants what's best for you.
Yes.
Now, even though you say Harper wants what's best for you, you decided against telling Harper about the potential job for Genesis in Paris.
Yes, I knew they would be really upset by it, and they were not fond of Genesis at all. And I didn't really want to make the situation worse, and I didn't want her to cancel the wedding or ruin anything.
But that's a yes to my question is you didn't tell her ahead of time. It came, yes.
Yes.
All right. It was a surprise to Harper.
Yes, I was hoping to avoid that conversation completely until at least after the wedding.
All right. So let's talk about the night of the rehearsal dinner, June 7th. You saw Harper give Genesis a bottle of wine?
Yes, no one else got that bottle of wine.
And you saw Genesis pour a couple glasses of that wine?
Yes.
And then you went to bed early?
Yes, I was quite excited to marry my bride.
So you don't know what else Genesis drank after the wine, after you went to bed?
I can't be sure. All I know is that Harper gave that bottle of Genesis and said that this is just for you, no one else.
You also don't know what else what else Genesis ate after you went to bed?
Everything that we shared, I know we ate. I don't know if she ate anything else.
Yes. So aside from and as you said, aside from the wine, you ate and drank everything that Genesis had that day?
Yes, we shared everything.
All right. No further questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Any redirect?
None, Your Honor. Just I asked that my witness be able to step down.
Of course. Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
Okay, anything further from the plaintiff?
No, Your Honor. With that, the plaintiff rests our case in chief and requests a brief 5 to 10 minute recess before moving on to defense.
That would be great. Do you all
We're
have
good with 5 minutes.
Okay, let's come back at 3:15 if we could. Okay, do we have everyone back and ready to get started again?
The plaintiff is present, Your Honor.
And I assume you're also present, defense, although you're muted.
Yes, sorry about that. The defense is also present.
That's all right. Let's hear from the defense then, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Your Honor. At this time, the defense calls Dr. Cannon. Good afternoon, Dr. Maybe we proceed.
Yes, go ahead.
Good afternoon, Dr. Cannon.
Good afternoon.
Could you please tell us what you do for a living?
Sure. Currently, I'm an associate consultant for Gardner Consulting, where I work on cases involving toxicology or pharmacology.
And what's your educational background?
I got my bachelor's degree in chemistry from The Ohio State University, and then went to Harvard Medical School, where I got my medical degree with an emphasis in toxicology.
You mentioned toxicology. What is that?
Toxicology is the study of the effects and treatments of poisons or different substances that can have a harmful effect on bodily functions.
Where have you worked in the past, Dr. Cannon?
I started out as director of toxicology at Massachusetts General. I worked there for about 9 years. And then for 10 years, I was a professor of toxicology at Midlands Medical School. And for the past 5, I've been working at Gardner Consulting.
And have you ever published anything in your field?
I have. I've written over 50 articles about toxicology and medicine.
And have you testified in court before?
Yes, I've testified in 35 cases prior to this case.
Now bringing us to today, how did you become involved in this case?
I was asked to assess the work and findings of Dr. Jimin Kwan regarding the death of Genesis Petrillo.
How do you go about assessing another doctor's findings?
I conduct what's called a comparative analysis. And that's where I take the original doctor's findings and conclusions and compare them to the standards in the fields of medicine and toxicology.
And are those methods considered reliable in your field?
Yes, I've used this method for all of the previous times that I've testified, and it's standard work in consulting.
What materials did you review?
I reviewed the same things that Dr. Kwan had access to. So there was Dr. Kwan's report, Angel Rodriguez's affidavit, multiple toxicology reports, Genesis Petrillo's death certificate, and an analysis of a wine bottle recovered at Peony Estates.
And were these materials sufficient to reach your conclusion?
They were.
And did you reliably apply your methods to these facts and data of the case?
I did.
Dr. Cannon, what were you able to conclude about the death of Genesis Petrillo?
I conclude,
Your Honor, at this point, to a lack of foundation under Rule 702.
Do you elaborate?
Yes, Your Honor. Specifically, I'm objecting to a lack of foundation under Rule 702C. If I could direct your attention to a piece of case law found on page 3, second to the bottom. It is Tarrant Readers Association of Midlands versus Merrill Dow.
Got it. I think I've seen that one around.
Yes, Your Honor. And this case law states that when assessing the reliability of a method under Rule 702C, the judge should take into consideration whether or not the theory or technique has been tested, whether it's been subject to peer review or publication, whether it has a known error rate, and whether it has gained widespread acceptance in the field. Opposing counsel has yet to lay any of these under Rule 702C and therefore is lack foundation.
May we respond?
Go ahead.
The defense feels that we have indeed relayed that there has been a proper foundation laid. We went over the method. We did go over the method Dr. Cannon used, and he did state that this is a reliable method in his field. This is something that he has used in countless other cases that he has testified for, and we feel that his method to the facts and data that he reviewed is very much reliable, and therefore under 702B is counted.
Anything else from the plaintiff on this point?
Yes, Your Honor. While I agree that opposing counsel has told us what the method is and that it's reliable, it's considered reliable in their field, We still have not been exposed to whether or not it's been tested, whether there's a known error rate, whether it has received wide acceptance within the field, or whether the method itself has been subject to peer review. Until they lay that foundation, I ask that they do not go into the conclusions that Dr. Cannon drew for today's case.
May we respond?
One more time, yeah.
To make a conclusion, Dr. Cannon only has to say that these methods were reliable and that he has used them in the past. If there's a problem with the plaintiff's, the plaintiff has a problem with the methods being used, she may bring those up in cross.
So I don't think I agree with that. I think the foundation is a threshold issue before the witness can testify to the conclusions. But I do think he's given sufficient foundation, so I'll overrule the objection.
Yes, Your Honor.
All right. So to repeat the question, Dr. Cannon, what were you able to conclude about Genesis Petrio's death?
I concluded two things to a reasonable degree of medical certainty. First, that the pesticides present in Genesis Petrio's body may not have come from the bottle of wine. And second, that Genesis Petrio's cause of death may have actually been from hepatic disease.
I want to take those one by one. So what do you mean that the pesticides may not have come from the bottle of wine?
We don't actually know where the pesticides in Genesis Petrio's body came from. Dr. Kwan assumed that the wine produced by Peony Estates was the source of that pesticide, but that's not actually what the evidence suggests.
What does the evidence support?
We know based on the toxins analysis that Dr. Kwan ordered that when Genesis Petrio went to the hospital, they had both wine and pesticides in their stomach. But that doesn't tell us anything about when either of those two substances may have entered her stomach.
How does this evidence relate to Dr. Kwan's conclusions?
The problem with Dr. Kwan's conclusion was that he made a leap in judgment. He found a cause of death that was consistent with the facts, and other causes were ruled out. Wine and pesticides were both found in the stomach. Therefore, the wine had to be the source of those pesticides. But that ignores any other potential source of those pesticides.
What else could have been the source of those pesticides?
Well, there are many possibilities.
Objection, Your Honor, under Rule 702 to a lack of foundation. May I be heard?
Yes, and could you just remind me exactly what the witness testified to?
Yes, Your Honor. Are you asking for me to relate or opposing counsel?
You can go ahead. If you misstate it, I'll trust Ms. Sikowski to let me know.
Yes, Your Honor. Your Honor, specifically, I'm objecting to a lack of foundation under Rule 702 that Dr. Cannon can testify to where the pesticide could have possibly come from, therefore drawing his own conclusions about possible causes of death, like they mentioned hepatic disease. While opposing counsel has established under Rule 702 that this witness can use a method of comparative analysis regarding Dr. Kwan's report, they have not established under Rule 702 that this witness can draw his own conclusions about where the pesticide came from, how it was hepatic disease, and therefore cannot testify to those just yet until they lay that foundation.
May we be heard? The question that was asked was, what else could have been a possible source of pesticides? Now, the witness Dr. Cannon isn't talking about a conclusion that the pesticides were specifically from one place or another. He is simply to answer the question of what else could have been a source for the pesticides within Genesis Petrio's system. And to go on to your point about the hepatic disease, he, by reading the assessment made by Dr. Kwan, your own witness, he was able to find other possibilities for a cause of death for Genesis Petrio based on the evidence and the analysis that he did about the symptoms that Genesis Petrio was showing that night at the hospital.
May I respond under those grounds, Your Honor?
Please do.
Your Honor, while I agree that the comparative analysis in today's case for Dr. Cannon has been laid, my objection specifically is to him drawing conclusions about it possibly being hepatic disease or any other sources like they have just elicited to the court. We have not heard under Rule 702C how he would have drawn these conclusions about how it could be from another source at all. Until they do so, we cannot hear this testimony from Dr. Cannon, since he hasn't told us how he would have come to those conclusions, what type of method he would have used to determine another source for the pesticide. They have only laid foundation for comparative analysis.
May we be heard?
Go ahead.
Under Rule 702C, the testimony just has to produce reliable methods and principles. There's no need to have to prove anything beyond that. And we feel that Dr. Cannon has proved that the method that he used has been reliable. It doesn't have to, no tests or any other analysis of his methods is required under Rule 702C. It's simply that he used reliable methods and principles.
Okay, I take the point. I'll overrule the objection. It seems like the kind of thing that would be within the scope of his expertise. I don't expect him to testify to being a pesticide expert, but I think generally he can talk about the sort of other sources that he can imagine a pesticide coming from.
Yes, Your Honor.
Do we have to clarify the ruling?
Oh, the objection's overruled. Go ahead.
Thank you. So to repeat the question, Dr. Cannon, what else could have been a source of these pesticides?
There are multiple possibilities. Organophosphate pesticides, like the ones found in Genesis petrio's stomach, are commonly used in produce farming. So what that means is if there was a fruit or a vegetable that was unwashed and ended up at that rehearsal dinner, it's entirely possible that that could have been the source of the pesticides in Genesis petrio's stomach.
So what were you able to conclude about Dr. Kwan's reason for the cause of death?
Dr. Kwan's cause of death required a lot of unfounded assumptions and concluded that just because one cause of death was a possibility, it was the only option. All we are able to say is that on June 8th, wine and pesticides were found in Genesis petrio's stomach. But that doesn't tell us anything about the time frame of ingestion or whether the pesticides were the sole cause of Genesis petrio's death.
Now, I want to move on to your second conclusion, that Genesis petrio's cause of death could have been hepatic disease. What is hepatic disease?
Hepatic disease, it's also known as chronic liver disease. So the liver, it normally detoxifies the body. But if someone has hepatic disease and they ingest something like alcohol, their body can no longer process it.
Now, what happens if the body can't properly break down alcohol?
Well, in that case, an individual can begin suffering from the symptoms of alcohol poisoning.
And these symptoms of alcohol poisoning are?
Well, alcohol poisoning, it can lead to nausea, slurred speech, and slowed breathing. Genesis petrio actually exhibited all of these symptoms on June 8th.
Now, are there any other ways to tell if someone is suffering from hepatic poisoning?
Yes, a sign of hepatic disease is low acetylcholinesterase levels. Now, that's a very long word, but it's just an enzyme that regulates muscle functions.
And were there low levels of that enzyme found in Genesis petrio's system?
Yes, Dr. Kwan ordered a blood analysis of Genesis petrio, and in that blood analysis, it was actually found that Genesis petrio's acetylcholinesterase levels were half of the normal amount, and that would be consistent with hepatic disease.
Do you know whether Genesis petrio had hepatic disease?
I don't, and that's because the blood test that was administered on June 8th was the first one for Genesis petrio in 3 years. And what that means is we can't be certain whether those low acetylcholinesterase levels were isolated to June 8th or whether they were a long-term problem indicative of hepatic disease. Hepatic disease, it can appear in a person at any point, especially in someone who, based on what I reviewed, is a heavy drinker.
Now, what were you able to conclude about hepatic disease in Genesis petrio's death?
I found that hepatic disease was a possible cause of death for Genesis petrio, and that pesticides may have actually exacerbated the symptoms of hepatic disease.
Based on everything you learned, what were you able to conclude about Genesis petrio's death?
Genesis petrio's death, it was complex, and it can't be constrained to a single cause. we can't conclude to any degree of certainty that the wine was the source of the pesticides or that the pesticides caused Genesis Petrio's death. Put simply, there are too many factors that we just don't know.
Thank you, Dr. Cannon. No further questions.
Thank you. Cross-examination,
Yes, Your Honor, may I proceed?
whenever you're ready.
Good afternoon, Dr. Cannon.
Good afternoon.
Now, Dr. Cannon, you're here today because you disagree with Dr. Kwan's conclusion that the cause of death was due to chemical pesticides, correct?
It's not so much that I disagree with that conclusion, it's that I believe there are a lot of things that Dr. Kwan ignored in his analysis.
But you acknowledge that the symptoms that Ms. Petrillo was experiencing on the night of June 7, 2019 were consistent with chemical pesticides, right?
Consistent, yes.
Now, I want to talk to you about some of the things that you said on direct examination. Now, it's your testimony today that it's possible that the pesticide actually came from unwashed produce, right?
That is a possibility, yes.
It's your testimony that it's possible that the grapes that were being used to ferment the wine could have been sprayed with pesticides.
Well, not specifically talking about the grapes, but other fruit or produce that was being served at the buffet.
Well, let's go ahead and talk about the food served at the buffet. Now, you'd agree with me in saying that none of the food that was found at the actual rehearsal dinner tested positive for a pesticide. Is that right?
That's right. None of the food that was remaining the next day when they conducted those tests had pesticides.
And not a single other person other than Ms. Petrillo experienced any type of pesticide-related symptoms.
Yes.
So let's go ahead and talk about your second theory about hepatic disease. Now, you thought that it was possible that Ms. Petrillo was suffering from hepatic disease, right?
That's right.
But it's true that none of Ms. Petrillo's medical records show any issues with her liver.
Well, yes, but medical tests don't always check for the liver, and recently she had not had a medical test.
Well, directing you back to my question, not a single one of her medical records indicated an issue with her liver.
No, her prior medical records did not.
Her prior medical records didn't indicate any type of indication that she had hepatic disease.
No, because it can emerge at any time.
Well, let's go ahead and talk about it a little bit more. Isn't it true that hepatic disease is actually the least likely cause of death in this case?
No, that's not true.
Dr. Cannon, is it your testimony today that hepatic disease is the least likely cause of death for Ms. Petrillo in today's case?
Of the causes that I discussed in my report, it is the least likely, but in general, no, it's not the least likely cause.
So it is the least likely cause of death in this case, correct?
Of the ones that I discuss in my report, yes.
Okay. So let's go ahead and talk about why you're here today testifying. Now, you're being paid $50,000 to testify today, right?
That's right. That's the standard rate.
And you're here because you're scared you'll lose a major client. Is that true?
No.
Well, isn't it true that one of your biggest clients is a company that makes chemical pesticides?
Yes, that's one of our biggest clients.
And they told you that you would lose their business if chemical pesticides were found to be Ms. Petrillo's cause of death.
I believe that someone said that to me, but that had no bearing on the opinions that I made in this case.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and talk about your opinions on today's case. Now, you think it is most likely that her death was due to respiratory arrest, right?
Yes.
And this is respiratory arrest due to organophosphate pesticide poisoning, right?
I believe that that's the most likely cause of that respiratory arrest, yes.
And you also think that it is most likely that the poisoning of, I apologize, that the pesticide poisoning was due to the car wine distributed by Mrs. Martini, correct?
Well, yes, I think of all of the possible causes, it is the most likely, but let's be clear, most likely doesn't mean anything in terms of scientific certainty.
Well, directing you back to my question, you believe it's most likely that the poison came from the bottle of car wine that the defendant gave Ms. Petrillo.
Of all of the possible sources of that pesticide, yes.
Thank you, Your Honor. I have no further questions.
Thank you. Any redirect?
Yes, Your Honor.
Go ahead.
Dr. Cannon, your work with Gardner Consulting has no impact in your conclusions made in this case.
Objection, Your Honor, to leading.
Sustained.
I'll rephrase. How would you, in your work on this case, were there any conflicts that you found with your job when reaching your conclusions?
Absolutely not. All of my conclusions were reached independently based on the facts and data that I was presented.
Thank you. No further questions.
No recross, Your Honor.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you.
The defense at this time, oh, he stepped down.
And he's gone. So we'll hear from the next witness.
Yes, Your Honor. We call Austin Lewis to the stand.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
May I proceed?
Please do.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Could you please introduce yourself to the members of the jury?
Yes. Hi, my name is Austin Lewis.
What do you do for a living?
I work at the Peony Estates Winery and B&B.
How long have you been in the winery business?
Well, I've always grew up around this business because my mom was in charge of the wine production over at Cumberland's Farm Winery, but I didn't start working at a winery until 2012 when I got a job at the Rosie and Pedro Winery.
When did you start working at Peony Estates?
I started working there around 2015 after Harper Martini offered me the job. We met while we were working together at Rosie and Pedro.
Ms. Lewis, I want to talk about today's case. How did you get involved?
Well, I am the head winemaker at the Peony Estates.
What does your job as head winer entail?
I take care of growing the grapes, harvesting, fermentation, aging, and bottling of the wine.
Can you tell us a little bit about Miss Martini's role at Peony Estates?
Sure. Harper is the owner of the winery, and they handled the business aspect of everything, like tours and marketing. They're much more business oriented than I am.
We've heard a lot about pesticides today. Why did you start using pesticides at Peony Estates?
Well, we started using chemical pesticides at around October of 2015 because the location of the winery led to a big pest problem.
Where's Peony Estates located?
It's at the Rapid River Valley near the Salope Swamp, which has a ton of pests and bugs. We tried to use organic solutions at first, but that didn't work. So we had to start using chemical solutions instead.
Where do you spray those pesticides?
Well, we started spraying the pesticides on the vines, and then in the wine cave, and eventually we started to use them in the interior of the Peony Estates.
How did using pesticides affect your role at Peony Estates?
Well, Harper and I got along with the rest of the staff. We had to get trained and get knowledge of how to safely store and use these pesticides. We did a lot of work, individually or as a group. Harper worked really hard too to keep the Peony Estates ready for business.
I want to talk about this case. Do you know why you're here today?
Yes, I'm here because Harper Martini is being sued for allegedly poisoning Genesis Petrio's wine on the night of June 7th.
Do you know what brand of wine Miss Martini gave Miss Petrio that night?
I do. It was a bottle of our newest brand of wine, the 2019 Cara.
Do you still sell Cara wine at Peony Estates?
No, we don't. Ever since this case, we dumped our entire supply of it.
Do you know what happened to the bottle of Cara wine that Miss Petrio received?
I do. It was found in one of our dumpsters a few days after the wedding rehearsal. I also know that bottle was tested positive for having pesticides.
Do you know if there were any pesticides in that dumpster before the wine was put there?
Yes, I do. We had thrown away some of our empty containers, as well as some containers that still had some pesticide in them.
When did you throw away those bottles of pesticides?
We put them in that dumpster a few days before the wedding.
Had the dumpster been emptied before that bottle of Cara wine was found?
No, they hadn't. The pesticides and the bottle of Cara wine were in the same dumpster for a few days.
Thank you. I have nothing further, Your Honor.
Your Honor, may I proceed?
Go ahead.
Now, Ms. Lewis, you're here testifying on behalf of the defendant.
Well, yes, I am.
And you've known the defendant for several years, correct?
Yes, I do.
And you two are close friends?
Well, yes, we met and we're close friends.
Yeah, in fact, the defendant actually gave you the job you currently hold at Peony Estates.
She did, as I said before.
Yes, and now you mentioned before you utilize pesticide at Peony Estates, correct?
Right, we do.
And the defendant was familiar with the pesticides you used there.
Yes, she was also familiar with the practices that we had around them.
Yes, more importantly, they told you how dangerous they knew pesticide could be for humans.
Yes, but I already knew that information.
Yes, and the defendant also told you that they knew that pesticides could be poisonous.
Yes, which is something I also knew.
Yes, and the defendant knew that pesticide could also be fatal.
Yes, because we received the same training and we know the same knowledge about pesticides.
And Ms. Lewis, you are aware that the defendant is being accused of intentionally putting pesticides in Ms. Petrio's wine.
I do, as I've stated before.
And the defendant has told you that if you mix pesticide with wine, you couldn't tell based at looking at it.
Yes, she has told me that before.
And the defendant also said that if you mixed it in, you couldn't smell it either.
Well, yes.
Now, Ms. Lewis, you know who Genesis Petrio is, correct?
I do know who Genesis Petrio is.
And you've had several conversations with the defendant about Ms. Petrio.
Yes, I have.
And you are aware that the defendant didn't like Ms. Petrio.
Yes, but I believe that no parent, that this was just a classic case of parent-in-laws not liking their future fiancés.
The defendant actually told you that she wanted the wedding to be called off entirely.
She did say that, yes.
Yes, and the defendant also told you that if she could make Miss Petrio disappear, she would.
Yes, but again, Harper can be very dramatic when it comes to family matters. I've learned it's just best to ignore it.
Yes, but isn't it also true the defendant actually told you several times that she hated Miss Petrio?
Well, yes, but I did not believe that it was with the intent to hurt her.
Yes, but redirecting you back to my question, the defendant did tell you several times that she hated Miss Petrio, yes or no?
Yes, she has told me that on a couple occasions.
Now, Miss Lewis, you currently own 10% of Peony Estates, is that correct?
I do. I work there and I believe in the winery.
Yes, and you are aware that if the defense loses this lawsuit, you will likely lose your job.
Objection, Your Honor, to speculation.
Response?
Your Honor, this is not a speculative question. This is a question that can reasonably be made in the case of this court. If the defense does lose the job and the defendant is found guilty, it is a reasonable assumption and does not require speculation.
May I respond?
Go ahead.
Your Honor, my problem is exactly that. Ms. Medina just said in her response that this is an assumption. That's the problem. It's speculation, and Ms. Lewis can't make those assumptions.
Your Honor, may I be heard?
Sure. So I think that it would be possible for someone who works somewhere to reasonably understand that if their company loses a lot of money, they could lose their job. But here, what do you believe is the basis for this witness's knowledge of that?
Are you addressing me, Your Honor?
Yes.
Yes, Your Honor, being in a position, I mean, just as you said, it is a reasonable assumption to say that if the place a business that you work loses a lot of money, then it is a reasonable assumption. At the same time, Your Honor, if the witness does not know the answer to my question, she is more than willing to say so.
May I respond?
One more time.
Your Honor, this is expecting Ms. Lewis to understand the economic fallout that might occur from any given verdict in this case. That's not something that Ms. Lewis can do. And as Medina has said several times, it's an assumption that she can't make. It's speculation.
Your Honor, if I
Counsel,
may.
well, defense, isn't it enough that she's a part owner of this business for her to say what the economic cost to the business would be?
She can say something similar to, like, something unrelated to the economic impact, something that would happen specifically within her field of knowledge. That's fine, but not an assumption based on economics or anything like that. I don't think she can make that assumption because, for one, she's not an economist and she doesn't know that kind of thing.
Your Honor, if I may respond.
Go ahead.
I am not asking the witness to testify on any economic aspect. I am merely asking the witness to testify on what will happen with their jobs specifically. And as it has been mentioned, as a partial owner of the estate, it is reasonable to expect that Ms. Lewis would have knowledge of this.
So I'm going to sustain the objection as to the question as phrased, which and if I remembered the question wrong, then just ask it again. But as I understand it, it was phrased absolutely, as in if you lose, you'll lose your job. I think calling for that sort of future knowledge is speculative, but you can certainly ask about the possible outcomes of a loss in this case, including the possibility of her losing her job. But I'm going to sustain as to that question.
Yes, Your Honor. Now, Ms. Lewis, I have one final question for you.
All right.
It is a safe assumption to say yes or no that in the case that you lose your job, you lose a lot of money as well.
Well, I don't believe that I can speak for any future premonitions of the Peony Estate's business. I can only theorize on what could happen to it.
Yes, but Ms. Lewis, I'm not asking about Peony Estates. I'm asking about your job in particular. I will re-ask my question for you. If you specifically lose your job, you specifically would lose a lot of money that is normally brought in by holding this position.
Well, yes, anyone who loses their job in turn loses their income.
Your Honor, I have no further questions.
Thank you.
There's no redirect, Your Honor. Can Ms. Lewis step down?
Yes, thank you, Ms. Lewis.
Thank you, Your Honor.
At this time, the defense calls Harper Martini to the stand.
All right. Whenever you're ready.
Good afternoon. Could you please introduce yourself to the members of the jury?
My name is Harper Martini.
Ms. Martini, what do you do for a living?
I am the proud owner of the Peony Estates Winery and B&B.
Can you tell us more about Peony Estates?
Sure. Peony Estates is a winery located at the Rapid River Valley. We are one of the largest wineries in the Midlands, and we host plenty of events from wine tastings to little tours around the vineyards. We even host weddings at the estates. But what really makes us unique is our bed and breakfast component of the estates. That was my son's idea.
Who's your son?
My son is Casey Soto. He is the light of my life. I mean, he's amazing, perfect even. I'd do anything for Casey.
Ms. Martini, do you know why you're here today?
Yes, I do. I am being sued for battery because the plaintiff claims that I poisoned Genesis Petrillo.
I want to be very clear for the members of the jury. Did you poison Miss Petrillo?
Of course not. Sure, Genesis and I had our disagreements, but she was my soon-to-be daughter-in-law, the fiance to my dearest, darlingest Casey. I would never want to hurt her.
When did you first meet Miss Petrillo?
I met Genesis in 2015 when my dear Casey had her come to our Peony Estates. From then on, Casey would bring her to the house often. Our relationship was a little rocky. Like I said, we didn't always see eye to eye. I think it's because I'm a mama bear. I've always been protective of my son, so seeing him with someone that I had never met before, that was scary. What if something happened to him?
Did you ever try to fix the rocky relationship that you had with Miss Petrillo?
Yes, I did quite a few times. I tried to show my support of the relationship by throwing an engagement party, and I also invited Genesis to a lunch with just her and I. It was important for me to build a good relationship with Genesis. After all, I wanted to get to know the person that my dearest Casey was in love with.
Why was it important for you to build a good relationship with Miss Petrillo?
Because it made Casey happy. Almost every time I made an effort with Genesis and tried to get along with her, he would come up to me afterwards with a big smile and hug me, and it reminded me of when he was just a little bean sprout.
Miss Martini, I want to talk about the wedding. Were you involved at all in the planning process?
Yes, I was.
How were you involved?
So I was the one who hired Blair Osborne and Sam Arnold because they are very good at what they do. And I thought it would relieve some of the stress off of the young couple. I also recommended that the wedding be at Peony Estates so that way the couple wouldn't run into any picky rules or crazy fees. Plus, it gave me the chance to use the wedding as some free advertisement for Peony Estates.
Miss Martini, weddings can be difficult. Were there any problems?
Yeah, it was rocky. It's a wedding, and at the end of the day, it was their first time at the rodeo. I wanted the process to be as smooth as possible, so I tried to help the best I could. But like any young person, they didn't want dear old mommy's help. And naturally, Genesis pushed up against a lot of things. But that's just what happens when different people work together on a big project. They have different opinions on what they think works best.
Did the tensions ease at any point during the planning process?
So the night before the wedding rehearsal, Casey pulled me aside and asked what it was going to take for me to bury the hatchet. We were the people that he loved the most, and he just wanted us to get along so he could have the best wedding ever.
How did you respond to that?
When I saw his face, he was looking at me with those little cute puppy dog eyes, and I had to agree. I mean, if getting along with Genesis meant that much to my dear son, of course I was going to do it. Anything to make him happy.
Let's talk about June 7th. What happened?
So that was the night of the rehearsal dinner. The wedding party was finally all together, and Genesis and I had been quarreling a bit. It was a big night, and Genesis showed up late. We were all so stressed out. But eventually, we just let it drop to have some fun. Seeing Casey enjoy himself, now that was all that truly mattered.
How did the night end?
Later on that night, we had some toasts and speeches and such. Hearing my dear speak, I was in awe. I was finally starting to understand how deeply my son was in love. Genesis made him happy, so I was happy. That was all too solidified when Genesis started speaking. Maybe I was wrong about her. I saw how much she cared for and how much she loved my son, and I was truly happy for them in that moment. And I tried to mention that in my speech.
What do you mean by tried?
You see, I have a pretty dry sense of humor. So thinking back, my toast might have been a bit better if I didn't try to push my jokes. I feel like it might have been taken the wrong way, but hey, you can't please everyone. I rectified the speech by having a better toast later on, complete with gifts of different bottles of wine from the Peony Estates, and given the very first bottle of my signature brand of wine, Cara, to Genesis as a gift and symbol of peace.
Miss Martini, what is Cara?
Cara is a wine that I have been aging for the past year. I tasted it a few weeks before the rehearsal, and I knew that it was ready to go, so I had put it on a shelf. After talking with Casey the night before, I thought that giving the first bottle of Cara to Genesis would be the perfect way to finally bury the hatchet and show Casey that I really do care about their relationship.
Is this the wine that you're being accused of poisoning?
Yes, the plaintiff claims that I put pesticides in it and gave it to Genesis.
Miss Martini, did you put pesticides in that bottle of wine?
No. The bottle of Cara was supposed to be a sign of peace. I would never hurt anyone, especially someone my son loved so much. Plus, their wedding was supposed to be a way to advertise Peony Estates. With Genesis's death, Peony Estates' name is ruined because everyone thinks that our wines are contaminated.
Thank you. Nothing further.
Thank you. Cross-examination?
Yes, Your Honor. Your only child is Casey Soto, right?
That is correct.
And Mr. Soto was supposed to get married to Miss Petrillo.
Yes.
But you didn't like Miss Petrillo very much, correct?
Well, when I first met her, she seemed like a bad influence on my dearest.
Directing you back to my question, you did not like Miss Petrillo very much, correct?
Not at first, no.
In fact, you wanted to get rid of Miss Petrillo so badly that you tried to pay Miss Petrillo $300,000 to disappear, right?
Well, she was a bad influence. She sent my son to the hospital at one point. I just wanted what was best for my daughter.
Directing you back to my question again, you wanted to get rid of Miss Petrillo so badly that you tried to pay her $300,000. Is that correct?
At one point, yes.
At one point, you even told Miss Petrillo, leave and save this family the headache. Otherwise, I will make you disappear. Is that right?
I did say that.
And on June 7th, 2019, the night of the rehearsal dinner, you continually referred to Miss Petrillo as a problem child during the first toast you made.
As I previously said, it was just a bad joke. It wasn't taken that well.
And afterwards, you ran into Angel Rodriguez while holding a canister of pesticides. Is that right?
That is true.
And when Miss Rodriguez asked what was going on, you said, it is for Genesis because Genesis is such a pest.
I did say that, but it was also a joke.
Later that night, you gave a second toast, right?
That is correct.
And during that second toast, you publicly gifted the special Cara wine to Miss Petrillo?
Yes, as a symbol of peace.
But everyone else got Horizon wine, right?
Yes.
And later, around 2:30 a.m., you got a phone call from an employee.
That is correct.
You were informed that someone had been rushed to the hospital.
Yes.
And after assuming it was Miss Petrillo, you went to her room, correct?
That is true.
But you did not find Miss Petrillo there.
No, I did not.
You did find the bottle of Cara on the floor empty.
I believe so, yes.
And that was the same bottle you gave to Miss Petrillo, right?
Yes.
It is true that you even threw the empty bottle of Cara away?
Yes, I did.
And now you are aware that that same bottle of Cara later tested positive for organophosphate pesticide, correct?
I am, but it was also found in a dumpster that we threw away some of our pesticides in.
Yes, organophosphate is the same pesticide you use at your winery, Peony Estates, right?
Yes.
And on June 7th, 2019, you were aware that mixing pesticides could be fatal, right?
Yes, I was. We had an accident with one of our previous employees.
Yes, and you were also aware that if someone drank pesticides mixed with wine, they would not be able to smell it, correct?
I was aware of that.
You had complete access to those pesticides?
I did because I'm the owner of the company.
Yes, and that same morning, or later the next morning, you ran into Angel Rodriguez again, right?
That's correct.
But before Mrs. Rodriguez said anything, you were already making plans to cancel the wedding.
I was.
And that was because Miss Petrillo had been poisoned, right?
Well, Genesis wasn't there, so I wanted to make sure that there were no upsets.
Yes, because you had assumed that Miss Petrillo had been poisoned, correct?
Yes.
But at that point, nobody told you about Miss Petrillo being in the hospital, is that correct?
Well, as you said before, I received a phone call that someone was in the hospital. And if Genesis wasn't there, it was just reasonable to assume that Genesis might have possibly gone to the hospital.
Yes, but nobody had told you Miss Petrillo was the one who was poisoned, correct?
Not directly, no.
And you did not go see Miss Petrillo when she was in the hospital.
No, I did not.
You also did not tell your son that his soon-to-be wife was in the hospital.
No, I did not.
And now you have admitted to being relieved, even happy, that Miss Petrillo is no longer in your life. Is that right?
Yes.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Any redirect?
No redirect, Your Honor. I just asked that my witness be excused.
You're excused, Ms. Martini. Thank you.
At this time, the defense rests their case in chief and asks for a brief recess, 5 minutes.
That's fine with the plaintiff.
That sounds great. Let's come back at 5 after, at 4:05. All right, are we ready to move into closing arguments?
Yes, Your Honor, the plaintiff is ready to proceed.
And the defenses as well.
All right, let's hear from the plaintiff.
Yes, Your Honor. And before I begin, may I reserve any remaining time that I have for my rebuttal?
Yes, of course.
Thank you. May it please the court. She thought no one would notice. Members of the jury, we've seen a lot of evidence today, and we've heard from a lot of different witnesses, so I can understand why that might be a little bit overwhelming. So before we comb through the evidence one last time, I want to take a step back, and I want to remind you of the events that brought us to this very courtroom today. On June 7, 2019, a very happy couple was so excited to get married the next day. They were going to get married at the defendant's winery, Peony Estates, just as the defendant had intended. But when the opportunity opened up for the defendant to get rid of Miss Petrillo and make her disappear, she took advantage of that. That day, Miss Petrillo knew well enough that pesticides combined with wine would go undetected. So naturally, she thought no one would notice if she was to gift Miss Petrillo a bottle of Cara wine just specially made for her. And when Miss Petrillo drank that bottle of wine, members of the jury, she slipped into a coma and she never woke up. Mr. Soto never got to see Miss Petrillo walk down that aisle, and we never got to see Miss Petrillo again. Today, we are suing the defendant for civil battery for her acts and her intentions on June 7th of 2019. Now, in order to win this case, the law requires us to prove three things. First, that the defendant committed an act. Second, that that act was intentionally to cause harmful or offensive contact to the plaintiff. And third, that the plaintiff did suffer harm. We had to prove these things by a preponderance of the evidence, which simply means more likely than not. So let's go ahead and talk about how we did that today. Now, first, we had to prove that the defendant performed an act. Now, today, there's no denying that that the defendant in today's case gave Miss Petrillo a bottle of Cara wine on June 7th of 2019. What is in dispute, according to opposing counsel, is whether or not Miss Martini actually put pesticide inside that bottle of wine. But what we heard from Angel Rodriguez in today's case is that when Miss Petrillo, just before the defendant gave Miss Petrillo that bottle of Cara wine, the defendant was carrying a bottle of pesticides. When asked what that pesticide was for, the defendant said it was for Genesis. Now, it's true what opposing counsel said in opening statements, that not a single witness is able to say that they saw the defendant put pesticides inside that bottle of Cara wine. And for that reason, they say that you can't find the defendant liable for battery. But that's what the defense is trying to tell you. That's not what the law says. You see, the law tells us that we simply have to prove that it's more likely than not that she put pesticide inside the bottle of Cara wine. And what testimony showed us today is that she did just that. You heard from Angel Rodriguez and from the defendant herself that on June 8th, 2019, when Angel Rodriguez ran into the defendant, she somehow knew that Miss Petrillo was suffering from pesticide poisoning, even though not a single person had told her. She told you herself, yeah, nobody had told me. I just knew. Members of the jury, the reason that she knew that Miss Petrillo was suffering from pesticide poisoning is because she's the one that made it happen. She's the one that committed the act. Second, we had to prove that the defendant intentionally performed this act to cause harmful or offensive contact to the plaintiff. Now, we've heard a lot of testimony from several witnesses about how much the defendant hated Miss Petrillo. She even tried to pay her $300,000 to get rid of her. She made several threats about making her disappear and even putting her 6 feet under, according to Mr. Soto. Now, we know that the defendant from Austin Lewis and the defendant herself, that she was fully aware that if she were to put pesticide inside of wine, that would have potentially caused the death of anybody who drank it. The defendant in today's case acted intentionally because she knew exactly what would happen if Miss Petrillo was to drink that wine, and she wanted Miss Petrillo out of their lives. Third, we had to prove that the plaintiff did in fact suffer harm. Today, you heard from Dr. Kwan, who told you just how much Miss Petrillo suffered. She walked into that emergency room completely in disarray. She was unable to control her speech. She was involuntarily twitching. And because of that, she slipped into a coma and never woke up. She died the day before she was supposed to get married. Members of the jury, we have proven these elements by a preponderance of the evidence in today's case. Now, the defense is going to have the opportunity to come before you and try and convince you otherwise. But I'll get to come before you once more and remind you of what really happened, and remind you how she thought no one would notice. And at that point, I'll ask you to find the defendant liable for battery. Thank you.
I think you're muted, Your Honor. Did you hit?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Something? Sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say thank you, and you can go ahead.
Great. May it please the court. When opposing counsel gets up here and tells you the defendant thought no one would notice, that may sound catchy, may sound compelling, but it's missing evidence. And the reason that it's missing evidence is because not every tragedy has a villain. Now, we agree. What happened to Genesis Petrillo on June 7th, 2019 was a tragedy. What happened to Genesis Petrillo shouldn't have happened, we agree. But where we disagree is with whose fault it is. See, when opposing counsel got up here just a moment ago, she tried to convince you that all of this was Miss Martini's fault, that Miss Martini was the villain in today's case. But by itself, those words are just that, words. It wasn't enough for opposing counsel to just get up here and say Miss Martini poisoned Genesis Petrillo. They had to prove it. In today's case, opposing counsel and the plaintiff are suing Harper Martini for battery. It's their claim that Harper Martini intentionally poisoned Genesis Petrillo's wine using pesticides, and that because of that, Genesis Petrillo died from pesticide poisoning. Now, that's a bold claim. When you make a claim like that in a court of law, you can't just say it, you have to prove it. It was the plaintiff's burden to prove by a preponderance of the evidence, simply meaning more likely than not that Harper Martini intended to harm Genesis Petrillo by putting pesticides in their wine. They have to prove, they have to prove each and every element of their case by that standard. If they fail to prove even one of those elements, they failed to meet their burden. Members of the jury, let's be clear. The plaintiff has failed to meet that burden today. Let's walk through all the ways that the plaintiff failed to meet their burden in today's case. First, how Miss Martini didn't have anything to do with Genesis Petrillo's death, and how no one in this courtroom can prove that the wine was the source of the poison. First, how Miss Martini had nothing to do with Miss Petrillo's death. Despite all the fingers that the plaintiff pointed at them today, Miss Martini themselves took the stand today, looked you in the eye, and told you that they did not poison Genesis Petrillo. Miss Martini told you that despite their differences, they actively tried to support their son and heal their broken relationship with Genesis Petrillo. You learn that Miss Martini wanted to give Genesis Petrillo a bottle of a special brand of wine as a peace offering, not as a vehicle for poison. Members of the jury, you don't even have to take Miss Martini's word for it. Remember the testimony of Austin Lewis, the head winemaker at Peony Estates. Miss Lewis told you that Miss Martini wanted to use that wedding as a business opportunity. And as a result of Genesis Petrillo's death, Peony Estates had to dump their wine supply down the drain. Members of the jury, we know that Miss Martini didn't do this because it doesn't make any sense for her to have. Let's talk about the plaintiff's second failure. The failure to prove that the wine was actually the source of the poison. Members of the jury, this is one of the most important parts of this case. And the plaintiff has done nothing to prove it. After hearing from 6 witnesses over the course of today's trial, none of them told you that the bottle of wine Genesis drank had any poison in it. The only witness that the state brought you to try and prove that point was Dr. Kwan. So I want to talk about Dr. Kwan's testimony for a moment, because Dr. Kwan got up here today and told you that he knew virtually nothing about this case. When I got up to cross-examine Dr. Kwan, I asked him the questions that we needed to know. I asked him, did the pesticide antidote work? No. Do you know when Genesis Petrillo ingested those pesticides? No. Do you know how those pesticides ended up in his system? No. Do you know if the pesticides were in the wine or in the food? No. Do you know if they were ingested on purpose or on accident? No. Do you know if another person put those pesticides in his food? No. On cross-examination, it became clear that Dr. Kwan was just guessing about the pesticides in the wine. Members of the jury, guesses aren't evidence. Remember that it's not our job to prove that the pesticides weren't in the wine Genesis Petrillo drank. It's the plaintiff's job and Dr. Kwan's job to prove that they were. And they haven't. So we can't assume they were like Dr. Kwan wants us to. But you also heard from another expert in today's case, Dr. Cannon, an expert in toxicology and a medical doctor. Dr. Cannon looked at the same evidence that Dr. Kwan did, except his analysis was more thorough and complete. He told you it was reckless to assume that the pesticides came from the wine, because that claim isn't backed by the science in this case. He told you how Dr. Kwan's logic was flawed, and that just because the wine was found in Genesis Petrillo's system, along with pesticides, that isn't enough to say it was the source of those pesticides. And that brings me to the last point. The fact that Genesis Petrillo may have died from something other than pesticide poison. Dr. Cannon told you flat out, Dr. Kwan did not take all possible causes of death into account. But he did. Dr. Cannon told you all of the symptoms that Dr. Kwan says were caused by pesticide poisoning may have been caused by alcohol poisoning and chronic liver disease. Dr. Cannon pointed out that Genesis Petrillo had low levels of a specific enzyme in their blood, which could have been an indicator of that type of liver disease. Unlike the plaintiff's expert, Dr. Cannon made sure that he looked at all of the possible reasons for Ms. Petrillo's death. At the end of the day, the plaintiff's case rests on you, the members of the jury, making leap after leap after leap in logic. When their case is riddled with I don't know after I don't know after I don't know, and they fail to prove even the smallest amount of evidence, it becomes clear what's going on with their case. The problem isn't just the lack of evidence. It's the recklessness of their claim today. They failed to meet their burden because without any proof, they tried to paint Miss Martini as the villain behind Genesis Petrillo's death. But we know that's not true. We know based on the evidence and the facts that this tragedy doesn't have a villain. That's why we ask you to find Harper Martini not liable for battery. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. Rebuttal?
Yes, Your Honor. Members of the jury, opposing counsel just got up here and they made a really big deal about the fact that we can't prove that there was pesticide in the bottle of car wine. That's just not true. We actually heard today in court from Dr. Kwan that the bottle of car wine that Miss Martini gave Miss Petrillo, it tested positive for organophosphate pesticides, the same pesticide that the defendant uses at her winery and the same pesticide that was confirmed to be in Miss Petrillo's system on June 7th of 2019. He also tried to make it a really big point that there were so many other possibilities for the cause of death in today's case. And they tried to do that through Dr. Cannon. But I want to remind you what Dr. Cannon actually told you. And that's that liver disease theory that he came up with, that's actually the least likely cause of death in today's case. And that he actually agrees with Dr. Cannon that the most likely cause of death was respiratory arrest due to organophosphate pesticides from the wine that was gifted to Miss Petrillo from the defendant. They want you to believe that there's no villain in today's case. But members of the jury, she was sitting here throughout the entire trial. And it's for that reason that I ask you to find the defendant liable for battery. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I believe that wraps up our trial, and I think before we get into any comments or anything, we're gonna submit our ballots and everything. Could I ask you though all to turn on your cameras so that I can put faces to the performances for doing rankings? Thank you. And then just give us 1 second to submit ballots and we'll get into comments.
Nick, I notified the tournament chair, so I think we're good to go with comments now. Both of our ballots are submitted.
All right, awesome. Well, I believe we have a scoring judge in here who should give some comments. Is that you, Amanda? I'm sorry, I don't know who my fellow judge is.
Yeah, that's me. You can go ahead first, though, please.
No, they've heard enough from me.
Okay, well, first of all, my name is Amanda Manzano. I'm a 3L at Wake Forest Law School. I am on the national trial team there and will be a prosecutor in the Bronx next year. Congratulations to all of you. Really well done. Truly some excellent moments in this trial that are honestly on par with law school competitions that I've seen. You all should be really proud of yourselves. I know it's the end of the weekend. It's been a long one, so I'll keep my comments really brief, but I do like to give a few constructive comments that you can take with you to future competitions or whatever the case may be. First of all, I just think the plaintiffs need to know that defense gave pronouns at the beginning of the trial, and those you just have to be really mindful of that throughout the trial as you do in the real world. Secondly, directs and cross exams. There were really great moments. One thing I would say is for most of you, really, this applies to try and simplify your language wherever you can. My rule of thumb is whenever I feel like I sound like an attorney, that's where I scale it back and just try and talk as much as you can like a regular person. You don't want to sound like an attorney when you're directing your witness. You want it to be just an honest conversation like a normal person. Lastly, with arguments, evidentiary arguments, there were some really great intelligently argued objections in this trial. But what I would encourage you to think about at times is whether or not you need that objection. Think about whether the evidence coming in actually hurts your case or not. There are times when it doesn't. And there were a couple objections that went back and forth 3 or 4 times in this trial where I felt like, you know, it's truly not very material or significant to your case one way or the other. So just pick your battles, because you can trust judges and, more importantly, the jury to sometimes be on your side when a witness is being finicky with you, or when your opposing counsel is trying to get something in that is not relevant or immaterial. But congratulations to all of you. Great job, really paid off.
And hi, everyone. Great job. My name's Nick Beachy. I'm a 3rd-year law student at Harvard. Big mock nerd. So this is my first time judging a Zoom AMTA competition, but it was a lot of fun. If we have team captains in the call, and I'm being serious here, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, but can I ask you guys to tell me, it's the end of a long weekend, do you want comments from me, or should I let you go? And please answer honestly.
We'd like comments.
I mean, you go to Harvard, so.
Okay. I'll give some comments. Can I ask what schools you guys are from now that ballots are in?
Well, I think, do they have to be cleared, or I don't know?
I think we have to make sure that they were filled out correctly. I'm not sure how we would go about finding out if they were filled out correctly. So
I think Mr. Beachy or Ms. Mazzano, if you have like a contact link to the tournament people, I think asking them is probably the best bet.
Let's hold off on schools for now. I'm very curious too, but I'm going to try and find out after all is said and done with scoring.
Okay. So my top level comments for both teams, the big thing is to do less. In my experience, you get the case at the start of the year. It's an early season invite. You get all this information and you're like, okay, let's go out there and let's like put all this information out there. This is my first time watching this case. And like, I sort of know what was going on, but you could cut out half the stuff and still tell me a story. And if you can do that, it would make it much easier for dumb judges like me who've not seen the case and like are sometimes slow to follow what's going on to follow. So just focus on like even fewer details and storytelling, and just give me like a very few moments to remember throughout the trial. In terms of performance, especially with Zoom being a weird medium for communicating, the biggest performance note I had pretty much across the board was that attorneys were not letting answers sit for long enough before asking their next question, both on direct especially, and even sometimes on cross. So that was one thing that I noticed throughout. I think I'll end it on that, because I also tried to take notes to submit on this Google form that they gave us. I just like wrote down things as I was thinking them. So please don't take my like notes seriously or as like any sort of like attacks on you all. You all are great. I just like wrote down if I thought something was good, if I thought something was bad. So just take them for anything they're worth and ignore them if they're not worth anything. So that's all I had. I hope you guys survived the weekend, and wishing good luck to all of you.
Thank you both so much for judging.
Thank you.
Great job, everyone. You are, you can free to leave the call.
Thank you.